What is the difference between your party and the Greens? Before our conference, there was still a very open question about if your party is different from the Greens in any meaningful way. I'd argue there wouldn't have been much point in your party existing if we'd adopted the same politics and the same strategies as the Greens. The fact is that overwhelmingly, conference decided that your party is explicitly a socialist party, with, quote, the working class at the heart of the social alliance it seeks to build. So I'll use the conference votes that passed as the basis for why your party is different, but also touch on how I think your party must be different from the Greens going forward. So I'd say I think the key area of debate and discussion is where do we stand in relation to the Greens? Do we form a kind of coalition with them now in the run up to the election? Or, do we aim to form a government with them? If so, on what basis? Do we want dual membership? These are all the kind of questions that we have. And I think really this comes back to a debate and the questions that the left has had for at least a century. And, ultimately this boils down to two strategies. One is called the Popular Front, and one is called a United Front. And the Popular Front is basically where, let's say, your party, we aim to forge a broad left coalition. So we merge with other parties, we basically become one. Whereas the United Front would be that, we'll work with other parties, with other groups on a case by case basis, but we won't, compromise our position or our socialist politics. So I think to give a, crystal example of Popular Front in action. And to be clear, history has shown that this can be disastrous for the working class, this kind of approach of a broad church and so on. But Corbyn is particularly fond of having a Popular Front approach. So when he was Labour leader, his whole thing was it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right of the Labour Party, we can all work together, we're stronger together. This whole kind of broad church and what I would say false unity, because you have to kind of the whole idea is that you're compromising and you're pushing down your actual political content to try and find some kind of common ground. And what you end up with often is a party that breaks apart because it does represent different interests and often different class interests. And as a one more example of this is what Corbyn tried with your party. At the beginning he welcomed in all these independent councillors and MPs, and some of these MPs were explicitly anti-socialist landlords, and one even having shares in property development. So this is where this whole kind of approach leads. Whereas I would say the approach we should have to the Greens is that of the United Front, whereby we won't compromise on our politics, but of course we'll work with the Greens on things that we agree with. And for example, if we're fighting against the far right, then of course we'll work with anyone who's up for it. But we won't we won't sacrifice our position. We won't, merge or dissolve into something akin to some kind of broad church. What that often results in is a kind of lowest common denominator and papering over cracks in terms of real divisions. So I'd say, that's one key distinction in terms of not only how we should relate to the Greens, but how the Greens view their strategy. They absolutely do have one of the Popular Front, of a broad church and so on, of forming alliances with, different classes and, all kinds of different ideas and different organizations and so on. So another, important distinction I would say is that Zach Polanski and the Greens are doing good work in terms of they're taking certain arguments forward and, taking consciousness forward in certain ways. They've taken a strong stance on trans rights, on Palestine, on, defunding the war machine and so on. However, at the same time, I'd say that they are actually taking, arguments and consciousness backwards in a very significant way. Most critically around this whole approach of parliamentarianism, it's called, where basically you see the way to change the world primarily as through parliament, through electing MPs. And I'd say what's happened in Britain is that enormous waves of the population have completely woken up to the fact that parliament is rigged. In fact, the whole system is rigged, from the police to the courts to the media and so on. And this is why you've actually seen across Europe this turn towards these right wing demagogues who paint themselves as anti establishment, as anti-corruption, as wanting to actually change the status quo and so on. But the point being that under the surface, all across the working class, people are, correctly concluding that it doesn't matter who you elect. They're all roughly going to do the same things because they're not really the ones in power. Largely Parliament is just a kind of pantomime where the real power, is happening behind the scenes and so on. So, and Zach Polanski is basically saying, look, this time it will be different. All you need to do is elect the Greens. And as soon as you pursue that approach of, aiming to get into power, get into parliament and to stay in government, you end up having to appeal to those with the real power inevitably, whether it's leaders of foreign countries so you can have good relationships, whether it's big business, big banks and so on. So, yeah, and if you want to, get into power in quotation marks, then you end up inevitably having to, appeal to those with the real power. Whereas what we're saying, and I hope in your party increasingly, is we want to seize power. This is maybe the most critical distinction between us and the Greens. And, to really kind of bring home this point around parliamentarianism, the Green parties around the world, they're all separate parties, but they all have this same approach of, thinking that's how you change the world is through getting, Green MPs elected. And if you look around the world at when the Green Party have got into government, whether it's Australia, Austria, Germany, Iceland, Scotland, many more, they've ended up implementing austerity. And that's because, they are a capitalist party. They do want to stay within and work within the limits and the logic of capitalism. And that means, inevitably capitulating. It means enacting the will of the free market, of the banks and so on. So yeah, and the same happened in Bristol and in Brighton, right? We've got green councillors, yet they're implementing austerity. And a final point on why, you know, we shouldn't see parliamentarianism as our main aim. To be clear, we shouldn't ignore electoral politics. It's a very useful platform, but really the real power, for changing society is in the working class. It's not in Parliament. Anyway, I'm going to read out a quote, and just for fun, I wonder if some of you can guess who this quote's by. So, our democracies are increasingly captured by a ruling class that seeks to perpetuate its privileges. Regardless of who's in office, the same people are in power. It is a democracy in name only, operating on behalf of a tiny elite, no matter the electoral outcome. So I wonder if some of you are thinking that might be Guevara or that might be Lenin. That's a guy called Steve Hilton, who's a leading Tory political strategist. And you'll often find this, that even, capitalists or representatives of the capitalist class are completely open about the nature of Parliament and how it's rigged and how, it doesn't make a huge difference who we elect. So, Zach Polanski, is really taking class consciousness backwards in a way and really kind of blurring the class lines. And, he's the working class are waking up, and in some ways he's trying to put people back to sleep. That's the most kind of clear way I can put it, I think. So the Greens are attracting many with their bold radical rhetoric of the rich must pay and speaking truth. However, their whole outlook and tactic is one of a broad church of the Popular Front, of raising awareness and optics at the expense of political content, especially class and revolutionary content. The Green Party distances itself from calls for socialism because it believes in attracting wide enough support that it can pressure the government and system into change somehow. This amounts to the same method applied by NGOs and liberals for the last 100 or so years, without fundamentally resolving anything. Trying to convince the capitalists to run society in our interests is like trying to convince a tiger to go vegan. So I'd say a really good example of where the Greens are really radical with rhetoric and saying what people want to hear, is the headline you might have heard around abolishing landlordism. This might sound like the Green Party have all turned into Marxists. However, sadly, if you look into the detail of this is not a serious attempt at abolishing landlordism at all. It's a mockery of what is a very serious aim. So I almost don't want to bore you with the details, but essentially their proposal is that you introduce rent caps, you build more council homes, you gradually increase the share of the market that is run, as social housing. And then eventually, if you keep having a green government for many, many, many decades, eventually there might not be many landlords left. That's pretty much it, and it doesn't take into account the fight back that there'll be from the landlords and so on, and the fact that the Greens are unlikely to get elected for many more decades, and that's not, then that's not taken into account, the race against time in terms of climate change and so on. So, you know, they're not they when people join the Greens and vote for the Greens because they've heard this headline, they're going to be very, very disappointed. And this is why we have to be different in not just kind of saying these radical statements, but having an actual path to delivering them. And, and this is an example of how, we can win people over on demonstrating why we're different and why we're serious about these kind of radical demands. So the global situation calls for fundamental change, not tinkering. This is the overwhelming fact of the matter. To spend the next decades fighting for reforms only, instead of fighting for reforms on the path to revolution, is to condemn humanity to a dystopian future. We need to base our approach on what is scientifically necessary, on the scientific consensus, that what we need is fundamental change, not base ourselves on what is, practical in inverted commas. If we stuck to what is practical, we'd still be living under feudalism or worse. So you might be thinking, Sean's being a bit extreme here, talking about revolution and global revolution. However, that what a revolution means is fundamental change. And any scientist in, countless fields, not just in climate change, are saying what we need is fundamental change and soon. So of course we need a revolution. And, really this deserves its own education session into, what is the nature of revolutions and so on. However, very quickly, I'd say a lot of people hear that word and they think, revolutions of the working class are, kind of chaotic, violent events. However, when you study them, what you find is that the working class organized society far better than we have already, very quickly. And, rates of crime, whether it's theft or, whatever, drastically drop. So, there's a lot of myths around revolution and what that actually means. And also revolutions are myths around what revolution means to, Marxists like me. Marxists do not think that you can make a revolution happen. What we would say is that as, pressures in society build, people will reach breaking point and, they will have an uprising. And our job is to ensure that uprising actually achieves our aims, i.e., that the workers actually begin to take control of our destiny. So, this is a general picture of what I mean when I talk about revolution and why it's necessary. The international nature of capitalism, of climate change, of what we're up against requires an international revolutionary solution. Our task is not to do what is comfortable or convenient, but what is necessary. And if you're looking at the scale of what we face, the Green Party's main policy for dealing with this, enormous existential crises is for a 1% annual tax on assets over 10 million and 2% on assets over 1 billion. I don't think I need to say that this isn't going to seriously address climate change or anything else that, we need to get serious about. And very often, unless you take a holistic approach to taxing the rich, of course, I want the rich to pay more. But unless you take a really holistic approach, often you don't even achieve your goals. For example, if we tax energy companies or fuel companies, what's to stop them just raising prices? It ends up on the shoulders of the working class. That's why, we need to actually take control of these companies and, I'd say have a planned economy more generally. I mean, that's a really good example of how it's not enough what the Greens are proposing. And, if you actually talk to Green Party members, they'll often completely agree with you on this. So, I'd say if you do meet Green Party members or voters, ask them, do you think we can avert climate catastrophe within capitalism? And if they say no, then, we're in agreement and we can talk about how we get there globally, how we deliver that fundamental change. But if they respond yes, that somehow we can avert climate catastrophe within capitalism, then, ask them how they think that's possible. Because any idea that the ruling class or the capitalist system would, enable this is well, it's evidently false. We can look at the world today. There's often this approach by reformists where you try and, constantly go around like whack-a-mole, the game, with a hammer trying to, hammer down all the problems that capitalism, constantly throws up. But the point is, no matter how good you get at hammering, the same underlying pressures are occurring, and you'll continue to get crisis expressed in different ways. And yeah, when we're talking to these people, I think it's easy to make the case that the only force that can deliver fundamental change is the working class, and only the working class can be trusted to run the world in our interests, and basically have a sustainable economy and so on. So yeah, I'd say I've had this exact chat actually on the train to one of our meetings. I was talking to a young comrade, and he said that him and all of his mates have left your party, and they've all joined the Greens. And I asked him, do you think the Greens have got any answers or are serious about climate change? And he said, absolutely not. So this is an example of where we have to kind of be different, be more serious, and also think about trajectory in terms of people are increasingly waking up to exactly the same conclusions as that young comrade did. What the working class is increasingly recognizing is that we need to expropriate the rich and switch from an irrational system based on profit to one based upon collaboration and mutual benefit. And this is called socialism, whether we use the word or not. And I'd say we have to think about, where the consciousness of the working class is going and kind of being ahead of that, not being behind it, constantly chasing where we think they are at now. And the truth is that no matter what you stand for on the left, you'll be called a dangerous Marxist. Jeremy Corbyn's a prime example. But instead of running from this McCarthyite demonizations, giving ground to our enemy as we retreat, we must stand firm and advance, proudly asserting what socialism truly represents and why it's the only serious solution to the crises we face. Ultimately, we must engage in the class war. It is a fight to the death, and we should treat it as such. Either capitalism kills us or we overthrow it. And we cannot win the class war with radical rhetoric and charming smiles alone. We need serious socialist policies to achieve our historic task and the organisation to back it up. We need to prove in practice why your party can be a vehicle for revolutionary change.